Welcome back to another reading and correcting of The Used Child by me, Kindar, the Tiger Rights, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. Today we are doing chapter 16. The image stopped Alex. The man in white had said he wanted someone acquired, and he'd made sure they'd known. Who it was from this. Oh wow, they knew who it was from the start. It was a boy, a child. He almost told Tristan they couldn't do it. There was no way they could go after a child. Pushed himself with a foot to turn in the seat, and his leg hurt. Nothing much, just a twinge. He might even have imagined it. Regardless, it wasn't caused by the beating he'd received. Too much time had passed, but it acted as a reminder of how Tristan could get when he was angered. The decision had been made. They were doing this mission. Alex messaged the twinged away, massaged the discomfort of kidnapping a child. What had happened that he could accept being part of something like that? He looked at Tristan. He wanted to blame the Somalian, but this wasn't on him, it was on Alex. He'd made himself like this, little by little. He'd become a monster so he could fight a monster. Now, he was working with that monster because there was nowhere else for him to go. He focused on the file to drown out the voice of his doubt, telling him he should just learn to accept the little Tristan offered. Because who else but that monster would ever want him? The boy's name was Emil Rithal, and he was located at the Orwell Academy. Alex breathed in relief. Pleased they weren't taking him out from under his parents' roof. The file didn't contain any information on who Emil was or why their employer wanted him, possibly leverage against a competitor. The man had looked corporate or maybe government, or it could be as a way of exacting revenge. None of those were good for Emil, but Alex reminded himself that wasn't his problem. His problem was doing his part to get the mission done. What was included were the plans to the academy, the location of Emil's room, and the security layout. This was what people who didn't do this for a living thought was needed to get in a building. No one ever thought context mattered. He'd have to get that himself. The ship stopped shuddering as they left atmosphere. He didn't have to coerce any system to get what he needed. At this point, so much was available publicly, if you knew where to look. Orwell Academy was close to 2,000 years old, an old institution even for people living on subjective time rather than objective. It was expensive and exclusive. He went through the list of previous attendees the Academy was proud to claim as its own, as well as what they had become. Planetary rulers, head of scientific research, corporate heads. He didn't bother checking the information. The Academy was too proud to falsify anything. This meant that Emil was important, beyond the scope of the mission. The question was, how important? The question was, important how? Who might be coming after them if anyone found out they were the ones who'd taken it? Tristan standing stopped Alex from starting a search on Rithal. The images of the pilot on the pilot seat showed the dark of space, with a few distant stars. Someone tapped a command on the control, and part of the wall of the small corridor unfolded into a seat. Here, Tristan indicated the seat. Alex looked at his screen. He wanted to do his search. There might have been a powerful Rithal family out there they needed to know about. You're not spending the trip awake, Tristan stated. I know. Then he stood. Then isn't it? What kind of system is it? Tristan stared at him. Alex wasn't sure he'd imagined the growling. It's just, he spoke in a hurry. I don't react well to fluid replacement system. On a good day, I can take half an hour to be functional. On a bad one, it can be hours. I just thought you should know that. Alex had no intention of angering Tristan by unintentionally throwing the plan off. Summerlin nodded, and Alex thought he saw approval in his eyes. It's an energy field. He had to have imagined it. Tristan didn't care. He sat. He tried to find a comfortable position as Tristan reached for the control Those are fine, and I never have a problem with them. We caught sight of the pilot screen, and there was a planet there, lots of white and gray cloud. Tristan stepped away and onto his seat. So they were here. How long had the trip taken? How much of that time did Tristan stay awake? Alex took his place and answered the first question by querying the time. The answer came back, including local time, which he ignored, and space standard time. SST was maintained by SpaceGov, and any planet who bought their way into the system had to keep SST time. Checking that, he found he'd been in cryo 8 months and 3 days. Alex then checked the distance they'd traveled and found that 8 months for it meant this cargo holder was much faster than it had any right to be. Had Tristan done those modifications himself? Based on all the ship schematic he had back at the house, it was possible and likely, but it hadn't happened there. Did he have another workshop hidden somewhere, or had he borrowed a shop with proper equipment? He was getting sidetracked. How long had Tristan been awake? That was more difficult to gauge. If the default hadn't been changed, cryo systems were programmed to deactivate as they entered a system's perimeter to avoid colliding with any of the faster-moving objects that could populate. How long it took depended on too many factors for Alex to know for sure, but getting the authorization to land at a port, which was what they were doing, based on how close to the planet they were, was still and still approaching, never took less than 12 hours. And he had to sit for 36 hours once, waiting for everything to clear. Alex decided that Tristan had been awake for a day on this side, 2 at the most. Before going under cryo, Alex couldn't know. He also couldn't know what the Somalian had done. He'd been safe. The cryo field made it impossible for him to be affected by anything outside of it. If it had been turned off, he would have known and felt whatever it was that was happening to him. His things, on the other hand, he made a note to check his pack the first chance he got. He gathered the information he could while they descended. They were headed for Certain, where the planet's third large port was located, almost on the other side of the planet from the Orwell Academy. The port had their information as Ertendorf, according to the provided SpaceGov rating, small-time Somalian trader and his partner, Jeffrey Gregory Flint. Alex glanced at Tristan. How had he known about that ID? Alex didn't have the time to do any checks, he knew that, but paranoia drove him to spend the time anyway. Tristan had found out about it while Alex was under cryo and managed to make his antique dealer's ID a partner. What else had he changed? The surface check didn't reveal anything. It now claimed that he and Hertendov had been partners for over an objective decade, through 7 expeditions. Nothing else looked to have been changed. Alex reached for his earpiece. He needed to peruse the database to see if Tristan had inserted any malicious program in it. He hadn't seen a Somalian ever do coercion, but Alex was aware that anyone determined enough and with enough time on his hand could coerce any system, even if they never vocally talked to it. What stopped him was the thought that putting the earpiece on would tell Tristan he was coercing. Would he believe him when he said he was just making sure Tristan hadn't set up something to betray him and not trying to take over the ship? What would he do either way? Alex's legs twitched. He'd have to check that later. Off the ship. He focused on Jeffrey's public information. Did he have to change anything? He hadn't brought any civilian clothing, but what he was wearing wasn't so obviously armored as to attract attention. And everyone knew that antique dealing often involved getting in dangerous places to acquire historically valuable items. He would have to remove most of his detectable knives to get away with 1 or 2 of them, both fiber blades, which he was already wearing, so Tristan couldn't have messed with them. The others would have to be monohedge, the only type that could be made from a polycarbon alloy that was still undetectable by security system. They landed without trouble. Tristan Ertendorf paid for 2 months' worth of berth time. They rented a hover and flew them. They then rented a hover and flew them to a city on the opposite side of the continent where he had Alex pay for a month's rent on an apartment. He knew this was to cover their track, but it felt like an excessive expenditure to Alex for what would be a few days' work at most. They couldn't get any of that money back. Tristan was out of the door as soon as he'd stepped into the apartment without giving Alex any instruction. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, small by the standard of an apartment, large by what Alex had gotten used to on the floor of his storage room, both of which had a computer. Alex sat at one, took out his earpiece, then stared at the blank screen. This was the perfect time to check on what else Tristan had done to his ID. He wasn't here, and Alex could erase any trace of his work from the system before Tristan was back. But he hadn't been given permission to use the computer. He didn't need permission. His leg twitched. Tristan had given him permission to use the computer in his room, Alex told himself, and he was claiming this room as his own. But what if Tristan wanted this one? This was insane. It wasn't like the Somalian would know. He couldn't have rigged the apartment yet. There was no cameras or sensors here. This was public housing. Alex still would have curse. Of course he'd know. He was Tristan. He always knew every damn thing. So the real question was if Alex was willing to risk Tristan's displeasure. He could use some of the time to coerce his way into Orwell Academy, use that as a cover, but he hadn't been given permission to use the computer. Tristan wouldn't get angry for such a small thing, would he? And if he did, there was no way he'd beat him, not while they were on a mission, right? He shuddered at the memories. He pocketed the earpiece and left the room. You bought this in yourself, he said to the empty kitchen. Now live with it. Should have known better. He should have stayed at Luminex, never come after Tristan. But of course, he couldn't do the sensible thing. He had to go after someone that wasn't even real. His father would be so fucking proud of him. With no orders, he had a limited number of things he knew he could do and not risk a beating. He ordered food. The last time he'd eaten was a few hours ago, according to his body, 8 months ago, according to the clock. Tristan returned a few hours into the stew cooking and headed directly to the other bedroom and sat at the computer. Alex stood at the doorway, watching. He couldn't see the screen from where he was, but he wasn't entering the room without permission. Can I use the computer in my room? Yes. And Tristan didn't look up or stop typing. The timer said he had a little over 3 hours before the stew would be ready, ample time for what he needed to do. He didn't look into Jeffrey, not with Tristan in close proximity, so he did the in-depth search on Rithal. Nothing came back that obviously linked to Emil. The wealthy family with that name didn't look anything like him. They could have modified him, but why bother? The point of putting a child through Orwell was to be able to claim doing so. You didn't hide what he looked like for that. He began coercing his way into one of the law system with plans to use their body recognition program. Emil had to have been with his family at some point. No matter how careful they were, they would have been caught on camera, and that would tell Alex who he really was. Only that wasn't the mission. This was Alex's curiosity he was trying to satisfy. And to what end? He could warn them. He wouldn't. It had nothing to do with Tristan or any beating he'd received. This was Alex's own pride. He might not like the mission, but he had taken it and walked away from Tristan. Alex had agreed to follow him, and that meant doing this mission. Alex would be damned if he was going to sabotage it. He went to the Academy's net location, got past their public persona, and smiled. Okay, talk to me. The system didn't have anything nice to say, which was expected. A place like Orwell Academy would use the best they could afford. It wasn't quite corporate level security, but the system knew what it was and what its job was. It took 15 minutes of coaxing and coding to get it to the point where it no longer saw Alex as someone to be kept out. The first thing he did was look in on ML. He was in his room, sitting at a desk, reading something on the terminal. A quick check told Alex it was from an internal library. He didn't bother looking that up. The room was clean, the bed didn't have any crease on it. There was no toys lying around and no box for them to be stored in. The only thing on the shelf was a data chip holder with over 24 chips stacked in it. Alex headed for the area in the system where the building's plan were kept. He had to do more convincing to be allowed there, but he was let in. The security plan showed showed they took that seriously. Reminded Alex of where Luminex kept him with all the sensors in the hall, cameras everywhere, and multiple checkpoints. Information provided by the employer hadn't shown the extent to which the inside of the building was watched. This didn't feel to Alex so much as a way of keeping anyone from entering the building, but rather as a way of keeping anyone from getting out. Had there been an escape attempt by any of the kids? The thought made him chuckle until he reminded himself that security systems were always upgraded as a result of something happening, not as a preventive measure. This was the result of 2,000 years of instructing kids. Alex no longer found it amusing. Having confirmed the nightmare the inside of the academy was, he accessed the plan for the outside and discovered it was worse than there because the entire security net had been redone 6 months before their arrival objective time. Whatever plans Tristan had made were based on out-of-date information or research to reassure him. He transferred the data to his pad and left his room. He found Tristan at the table eating some stew. It couldn't be ready. The timer indicated it still had an hour to go, but he was chewing away like everything was normal. Alex reminded himself Tristan ate nutrient bars, so this couldn't be anything anywhere near that horrible. We have a problem, he said, the datapad on the table. The academy upgraded the security around the grounds. He brought up the plan to a titanium array. Tristan said between bites, I saw it. How? Alex looked at what he'd gotten and how much work it took to get it. Was Tristan that good with systems that he'd gotten the same without talking to it? I went to the academy to look the place over. The news it hadn't been coercion relieved Alex. How did you see them? He brought the array detail with a tap. According to this, it's camouflage. Not very well, Tristan replied, not looking at what Alex was showing. Alex waited for more. When it didn't come, he continued with his concern, careful to keep his voice neutral. You haven't said what the plan is, but this system uses stuff like body heat, sound, seismic to detect who is and isn't there. There's no way to sneak through it. There's always a way in. I'm not seeing one here. Tristan kept eating in silence until his bowl was empty. He nodded to the datapad. How did you find out about the new scanners on the ground? They're mentioned on the Academy security plan. I got the details on it from Titanial. It's all public on their site. So it was just a question of finding the right model, and you looked at the Academy security plan? Tristan studied Alex's face. Of course. So you simply accessed them in a couple of hours. Tristan was incredulous. It took me under 30 minutes to convince the system to let me there. In total, it wasn't the first thing I looked into. I had to find the right model on Titanial's site and read the specs to. Tristan raised a hand and Alex stopped talking. Someone didn't say anything. Eyes fixed on Alex, and a speculative expression on his face. Alex began wishing he'd been able to bring his gun through the port security. He knew from experience knives wouldn't do him any good against Tristan. Maybe you should start running now. You're screwed up. A voice that sounded a lot like its father. Now stand there and take your punishment. You knew this was coming. You want to make it worse by running? Tristan stood and Alex danced. Show me. He motioned for Alex to move. He was up and heading to his room. He had the earpiece in his ear before sitting down. I'm back, he told the system, doing a check of its state. Antibodies had undone some of his work, so he set a program to fix that. He saw no indication the Academy coercionist was aware he'd been in. What do you want to see? He asked Tristan. That was faster than 30 minutes. Barely been 2, Alex thought. I didn't have to do anything now. The system still knows me. I just took the time to see how much repair it did while I was away. Show me the security layout, Tristan said, sounding distracted. Looked at the plans, highlighted the camera location inside and outside. Studied that guard poster. This took Alex a little longer to reach. He hadn't been to that part of the system yet, and it had its own program to try to keep him out. The list came up, names and pictures. Tristan motioned for Alex to scroll through it. This one. Tristan tapped the finger of a man with a square jaw and graying hair. Alex brought the file of Walter Kruger up, 56, subjective and objective, employed at Orwell for 20 years. He began reading the notation, but didn't make it through the first one. Leave the system. Alex backed out, erasing any trace of his presence. There had been a tone of finality in Tristan's voice. The only thing he left, out of habit, was his administrative level access, hidden between folds of code. Once done, he looked at Tristan and sent the terminal to a different site. Can you get in there? The site was for Weber Security Escort. Dismissed the public interface and looked at the code and near to how the system sounded. This is going to take a little longer. The system sounds more... Do it. With a nod, Alex focused on the code. Hello there, don't mind me, just passing through. Leave, Weber's system replied. Alex had a swarm of exploratory program. Where are your manners? You didn't even say hello. Leave. Did they have your personality trimmed? It sounds like it to me. I'm Crimson. What's your name? The code around the communication port highlighted as its programs found them, and the scanner programs muffled them. The antibodies attacked them immediately, and Alex said more to ensure they wouldn't be overwhelmed. The system hadn't said a word while he worked. How about we do this? You say hello, you give me your name, and in return I give you a wider vocabulary. Leave. The system sent programs out, and all but 2 went for the communication nodes. Mass didn't have anything in them that looked like they would attack his program, so they were alarms destined for the company's coercionists. His programs would deal with them, so he followed the 2 errant string of code. Now, where are they going in such a hurry? The system didn't reply, and Alex had to limit himself to the next junction point ahead of them, since he couldn't see anything of interest past that. But it was limited to half a dozen junctions, and this part of the system was a maze of them. Someone had gone out of their way to keep coercionists like Alex from being able to outguess those 2 strings. At the next junction, the strings went in different direction. Couldn't do anything to stop that. This wasn't something programs could handle, and without knowing what they would trigger if they reached a destination, or by not reaching them, all he could do was stick with one until he could figure out what they were going to do and send a beacon program with the other, so it would be easy to find in this chaos. He almost had missed it for 2 nodes against the background code. With only 4 jumps to go, he only caught it because of how it distorted the surrounding codes. He set a program ahead, and with 3 jumps to go, it told him what this was. A hidden communication node. Okay, now that's just not nice. He launched a volley of program against both strings. Now that he knew what they had to do, he knew destroying them was the way to go. We're having a private conversation, and you want to bring other people in? He waited until he received confirmation both command string had been destroyed. I want you to remember, I was nice about this. I said hello. I even told you who I was. You haven't. Leave. He even said 2 words to me. This is how you're going to be. I'm going to stop being nice. Alex sent programs out and had them multiply as they went. Let the antibody try to deal with them. You brought this on yourself by being a jerk. The programs confirmed they had reached their destination, and Alex activated them. The system gave a scream only Alex heard. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. There were times when he loved that sound. When the system fell silent, Alex looked at the code. Oh? Greeting, Crimson. The system replied in a welcoming tone. How can I help you? Isn't this much better? Yes, it is. Thank you. You're welcome. Now, give me a moment. He glanced at Tristan. I'm in. He went back to typing. It wasn't because he'd rewritten the system's personality that the antibodies stopped doing their work. He'd only encountered one system that had figured out how to rewrite its own antibodies, and he hoped there would never be another one like Gully out there. Bring up the employee roster. Alex had that up, and Tristan went through it faster than Alex could follow. He stopped his search on Aaron DeBien, man in his mid-30s, black hair, athletic build, and blue-gray eyes. Alex thought he looked familiar. Tristan placed his data pad with Alex's picture next to the screen. Now he saw the resemblance. Replace the picture. He swapped the image, then followed the created thread, keeping them from embedding the change. He did a check to ensure he hadn't missed one, and when the system confirmed this file hadn't been touched by outside code for 3 years, he was satisfied. He looked at Tristan for instruction. That was fast. There was no doubt in Simone's voice. Alex shrugged. It's what I do. This wasn't even much of a challenge. I've gone up against tougher system on a daily basis when I worked on Luminex. You did know that was what I did there, right? I'm a coercionist. Tristan didn't respond. Alex looked at him, tried to see something in those cold eyes. There had to be something there, right? Jack hadn't been real, but that moment in the clinic when Tristan had reached out to move his hair, that had been a caring gesture, hadn't it? There had been no reason for it. He hadn't needed to lie at that point. Alex couldn't think of one reason for having done it. If only he could find some kind of sign it was what it had meant. Not finding it again, he took a chance. Tristan, whatever you were doing back then, I would have helped you. No, you wouldn't have. There had been no emotion in the words. Tristan wasn't angry at the presumption. He was simply stating a fact. Alex looked away, the lack of emotional response hurting more than being lashed out at. His image on the screen looked back at him. Why did you have me put my picture in this file? That felt like a safe subject. Because you'll be the one to get our target out of the academy. Alex looked back at Tristan. Oh, that is a bad idea. I'm not the actor you are. That doesn't matter. Weber only hires human. Then there has to be another security company we can use that isn't speciesist. People who send their offspring to a place like Orwell Academy don't use the second best. Weber is the best security company on this planet, so you need to go in as one of them. We don't have an ID badge for me. I can't just tell them this is who I am. I'm going to have to prove it. That will be dealt with once your new uniform arrives. And this concludes chapter 16 of The Used Child. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next one's going to be, subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the book, as well as the other ones in the series, they are available on all major e-retailer. If you want to support me and get access to basically everything I've written, you can do that on Patreon. You want to listen to me doing these live, it's on Twitch every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time. The links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.